Welcome to Media Voices, everybody. I'm Chris Sutcliffe.
I'm Esther Thorpe.
And I'm Peter Houston.
This season, we're doing something slightly different, and every episode is going to be an in-depth exploration of a topic that we'll be exploring more fully in our Media Moments 2022 report. And as part of that, we're going to be bringing in a guest for every single episode. So this week, we are delighted to be joined by Chris Jansen, who's head of local news global partnerships at Google. And Chris, I believe you were a former journalist as well.
This is true. So well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Nice to meet you all. And for all of you out there listening, shared with our host that this is my first ever podcast, and they promise they'll treat me nice. They'll treat me nicely.
We'll be gentle.
Let's hold them to that. So yeah, my university degree is actually in broadcast journalism, and so I started my career in radio news. So I was a news director for a small company that had 3 radio stations in one building, all in each in one tiny room. So I would run back and forth between the rooms to do the news on the air. And so I had some very early lessons on how hard it is to do original reporting on a local level, especially when you're a small business and there are lots of other things to do in a small business, and everybody has to pitch in and do their part. So I remember those days. I mean, I remember that it's hard to be a small organization, number one, and it's hard to be a small news organization. And so that's from an ethos perspective, that helps me in my role as we contemplate our work with the local news ecosystem specifically. So yeah, some good memories. Good memories that I keep alive.
Good memories, stressful memories, all bundled together. That seems to be the local news experience. But as we mentioned, this is going to be a topic we're going to be exploring more fully in Media Moments. Esther, I believe that the lucky listeners can actually pre-register this year for that. Is that right?
You can, so you don't even have to remember to download it on November the 30th. You can pre-register to receive it as soon as it goes live over at voices.media/mm22.
Perfect. And we do want to mention that this season and the Media Moments 2022 report are sponsored by our friends Pool. Pool are the membership and subscription suite, an all-in-one platform for digital publishers to convert, manage, and retain their members and subscribers. Do stay tuned because we're going to be telling you how to reach out to them at the end of the episode. But as we mentioned, this week we're going to be talking about local news. This is actually the first time we've done it. Why would you say we're doing it this year?
The way things are changing at the local level is interesting in itself when you compare it to like national news. I think there's a bit of a resurgence going on. Maybe people are paying more attention. Maybe local news is starting to do different things than national. So I just think there's more to talk about maybe than there was before. I think in the UK we had Cairn Cross report. And I think that made people think, but was there any activity or action after that? I'm not so sure. But now I think we can actually talk about some real life examples, and that's much more interesting than talking about this sort of theory in a government report.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen some new players coming as well. But Chris, from your perspective, what would you say have been some of those trends around local news that you've seen flourish and really come to fruition over the last year?
One of the big ones for me is evolution of business models. So if I speak about the United States specifically for just a moment, it's a couple of years now that local newspaper publishers have been telling us that their number one priority is to drive consumer revenue, namely subscriptions revenue. And advertising is a fast follow to that. And so it's been interesting to watch that evolve. That story has not changed much, but we're starting to see other things come into the starting to see is the wrong way to describe it, but I think they're being perhaps talked about more. And those include any other way to support a local news organization from a revenue perspective. And I think it brings up really interesting things like contributions, direct contributions, not just a subscription-based contribution, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the whole concept of looking at membership models for local news player. I just think maybe we're reaching this point where people really are understanding the importance of the local news providers in their communities and how important it is for them to directly support them somehow. We think a lot about these type of things at Google. I mean, our goal is to be helpful in any regard related to this. We genuinely believe in the criticality, how necessary local news is for communities and society, and we seek to be supportive in some way.
So at the top of the episode, I was going to bring up the fact that, although we're going to be talking about local news, what we're equally talking about is the lack of local news as a result of trends that we've seen over the past couple of years. So, Chris, before we move on to go through some of the media moments from the year, where do you think that recognition of the criticality of local news is coming from? Is it from people seeing, the effects of a lack of it, from those news deserts? Or is it just because we are getting better as an industry at communicating how vital local news is, not just for the media industry as a whole, but for the communities who it serves?
Yeah, so this is certainly me search, not research. N equals 1, but this is kind of based on my my observations. I think it's all of the above.
I'm stealing that me search. That is brilliant.
I did. Oh, please, I didn't invent it. I stole it from somebody else, though I don't remember who.
I love that.
It's a circle of theft. It's fine.
I can use that. I could use that to justify anything I say.
Steal like an artist, as it were. I think there has been let's face it, there have been some extremely interesting things not to be flip about it, but from a political landscape perspective that have been happening in many, many parts of the world. COVID, I think, certainly had a major impact on driving people to their local communities, wanting to know what's going on globally, but wanting to know what's going on in down the street, that type of thing. So I think I think there have been some messages that we as a news ecosystem have been delivering effectively. We've tried to play a part by doing support local news campaigns from the Google side to evangelize the importance. And there's still folks out there who don't realize that it costs money to produce news, right? That it requires investment. And there's that dynamic because I think most people view their news as kind of a human right. It's like, of course I should have access to news. And it doesn't occur to them what goes into producing it. So I think having that discussion more is producing fruit. That sounds like a very awkward way to phrase it, but is having some impact here. And so perhaps that's what we're seeing.
Nice. I'm so glad I asked that question because that is such an optimistic way to start this conversation, because it implies that a lot of the worth that people are placing in local news now is based on recognition of the good work that they've been doing. And I think that where we've seen a lot of that good news is in the local news startups. Esther, where have we really seen some of those startups come into their own over the past 12 months?
Where? I mean, all around the world.
Yeah. But specifically in how they're dealing with their audiences.
Yeah, I think it seems to be that as sort of quote a lot of the mainstream organizations, legacy organizations have pulled back, the same kind of need has been there, and so you've seen media organizations spring up around those needs. And I think what has changed in the last couple of years, which wasn't so easy in the past, is that the infrastructure to set up your own media business, it's easier than ever. So Substack, actually, they put $1 million commitment to support local journalists launching publications, just email newsletters. So, you don't need to pay anything to Substack. You just log on to their platform and send an email newsletter, and you start to become a local source of news. Obviously, there's a lot more. If you want to do it properly, there's a lot more that goes into it. You need to, have rigorous reporting and standards. But we spoke to a number of people at the start of the year for a special episode on US local news startups, and a lot of them were sort of ex Tribune, ex Alden employees that increasingly were finding that they couldn't do the reporting they really wanted to, that really mattered to the community. So a lot of them jacked it in and ended up just starting up their own publications, and they're doing really well because the tech you need is absolutely minimal, and you can start generating revenue really quickly with a lot of the membership support schemes and things going on. Again, advertising infrastructure is very, very easy to pick up and plug in these days. A lot of them were saying there are business challenges as a learning curve going from a journalist to a business person, but it is easier than ever. And this is a blessing and a curse. It's easier than ever to start up your own publication and to start to fill that local news gap. And I can't wait to talk about my media moment later because it ties into that and it's not good.
I actually think that infrastructure piece is really interesting because I spoke right at the beginning of the year, February, I think, with Ryan Heafy at 6 a.m. City. And a big part of what they did, because they grew really quickly, they ended up in like 24 cities over, 18 months. a couple of years. And a big part of what they did was the playbook that they produced. And it's exactly what Esther's saying. It's that proper, as long as you've got that technology, the baseline in place. What's really interesting about 6am City is they're actually putting human beings on the ground. And I think
so are Axios. It's the same Axios model. You just need a newsletter and a reporter.
But and obviously we've seen some good numbers out of Axios, and particularly Axios Local there, which hit 1 million email subscribers in June of this year. We can probably assume that's much higher now. So, Chris, from your perspective, from the kind of the tech perspective, is that democratization of the tech that allows mass communication around a topic like local news? Is that something that has gone hand in hand with rising propensity for people to pay for digital news and increasing habituation from the public of paying for things online? Is that something that you think has kind of had I was going to say a glow up that has had a sort of an effect on the ability of these local news startups to generate enough revenue?
I love this part of the conversation because Esther, what you surfaced is something that I and we at my company think a lot about. If we think about my perception is, or my observation is, that somebody who's going to start a new news organization, a hyperlocal news organization, maybe it's 1, 2, 3 people, they're usually doing that from a place of passion and personal interest. They're not doing it because they want to learn how to run a content management system, right? They
certainly
need technology.
Not doing it for a quick book.
They need technology solutions that just work so that they can focus on doing what they got into it for, which is producing journalism for their communities. So I think this is a really exciting area. And if we think about each of us as a consumer, we're so used to technology being seamless nowadays. Like we get annoyed when there's not an easy workflow to make an online purchase, like if it's more than a few clicks. So the societies are becoming conditioned to expect easy workflows from a technical perspective. And so I think that is beneficial to news publications, such as in their subscription workflows, to have tech that is easy, makes it easy for the user, and is a low lift from an engineering perspective for the publisher.
Yeah, I will say I was actually reading something a couple of months ago about so that's great, and that in theory should mean that people all over the world can start off their own news publications. But when we were putting this together, I was trying to find examples of startups in other countries, and it's actually quite difficult to find. And there was a report earlier in the year that suggested that actually the philanthropic element in the US is far greater, and a lot of these startups will have they'll be quite reliant on gifts or donations from people. And that sort of, I suppose we call it kind of the billionaire financing here in the UK, at a much smaller scale. That kind of people with lots of money wanting to put some of that towards local news is definitely not something we see replicated in many other places in the world. And I don't know if that gives the US a bit of a kickstart, or if are people just not telling the stories of people in Europe and elsewhere. I don't know.
I'm also not sure that there's the same news deserts.
Yeah,
in other places.
We need to flag that.
I was in South Africa, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, Media 24's internal conference. And I spoke to some people that were doing local papers, and they're still doing local papers. And it was interesting having conversations with journalists, because there's that kind of mixed thing of really proud to be doing what they're doing at the local level, but also thinking, well, actually, it's the shopping offers that are in my paper that are getting people to pick it up. And that, it's always been like that idea that people pick up their local paper because of the classifieds or because of whatever. So that's still there in some markets in a way that it's just not in the States, and probably not in the UK anymore. I think that could be fascinating, what these different markets look like, but I guess we don't have that information right now.
I think Esther's right as well. It's genuinely hard to find information about this. And I was reading a report from OneIFRA about table stakes Europe, and they were saying that in a lot of cases across Europe, what happens is that some of the bigger newsrooms almost invest in partnerships with new startups to fill what they see as a little gap, but it does not equate in any way to those news deserts. What I think would be interesting is to talk about what it actually means to have a paper, the UK, say, in a local area, compared to what it used to be a couple of years ago, because we know that the cuts at places like Reach, basically mean that they do not have individuals on the ground anymore. They've all gone back to those super hubs. So
Reach is trying to change that.
They are, but has the damage been done? I suppose is the question, because I have not heard.
Absolutely.
I have not heard a single good word said about most of the Reach sites.
I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, but think about what people talk about, kind of the local news experience on websites in the UK.
Yeah, okay, but that's
universally
a tech thing.
negative.
That's not a content
That's true.
thing. But there's another regional or local publisher in the UK beginning with N, who I have heard it said that they're not investing in local journalism on the ground.
Why would you censor yourself on that one? That's so weird.
Well, because I've seen some really, really harsh coverage.
We're aware of an example out of Romania, actually, that was a participant in one of our Google News Initiative startup labs, and they do actually have some optimism for user donations. So the name of the publication, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, is Atlazo Erdeli. And they have used their experience from the Startups Lab to launch a framework for donation campaigning. So they have opted to go with a not-for-profit model, and they have a system set up now for period donation campaigning. They've also focused on what many publications are focused on, which is subscriber growth, experimenting with new strategies there, and thankfully getting some value out of the GNI Startups Lab in that pursuit. So there are some examples.
And absolutely, we've seen some of that replicated in the UK as well. I think when we interviewed Joshi Herman for the Manchester Mill, if you're not necessarily doing it for huge profits or for to keep your shareholders happy, you can deliver really, really good local news.
As you were speaking, what was coming up for me is I think about a small organization. They're starting that organization probably not because they want to become rich. Right. They're what they're really seeking to do is provide a service that's meaningful to them, and they want to cover their costs and hopefully make a decent living in that pursuit. So, that's certainly different than a much larger company that might be a public company that has an obligation to shareholders to drive profits. So it's tough to know if those worlds will ever come closer together, or whether they will. Perhaps it's more likely that they'll always remain pretty separate cohorts of publishers.
Relatedly, my question was: we saw a couple of years ago The Overtake, which was a Leeds-based local news startup in the UK. They closed down, and part of the problem was that they had hit that critical point where they could not scale. They weren't getting enough money in advertising and sponsorships to allow them to grow at the pace they wanted. So they sort of said, well, look, we served our mission for a couple of years and now we're calling it quits. At this point, can you grow a local news startup to that point?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this. I'll offer just a couple. I was just actually talking with a US-based publisher literally yesterday who was talking about, it comes down to a question of addressable audience, doesn't it? Right. So if you're a local publisher and you theoretically have an addressable audience that's only so large, like people who are going to be interested in that community's content, and is that large enough to sustain that publication? And one way that a U.S. publisher is thinking about it is truly returning to the newspaper model. The newspaper was the hub, right? You would go there, to your point, for classified and all other types of content. And can you recreate that in a digital experience to truly make the local news website the hub for the community, where they can have access to things at a national or global level that may interest them as well? So I think that's a really interesting path for local organizations.
I hate the phrase horses for courses because it doesn't work in my accent.
One more time.
Horses for courses.
Thank you very much. Now purple burglar alarm, please.
Purple burglar alarm. There's some really focused community community publications which I think are there with a mission. It's very specific to the community that they serve. Then there's other ones like this. Well, we mentioned 6am City, which is almost stepping back from news in the sense of hard news or investigative news, and doing community news, so sports or charities or activism in the sense of getting people involved rather than in campaigning. and I think each community in that sense will come up with their own answer. And some of those communities will be tiny and some of them will be huge. It depends what we really mean by local. I think that's a very different thing in the States than it is in the UK.
100% is, yeah.
Chicago, what's is it? Chicago Sun-Times has just gone non-profit, dropped a paywall. On one level, that's local press, but it's very different from the likes of the kind of Walthamstow Echo or whatever it is that prints once or twice a month and you pick up in your local grocery store.
Yeah,
but they all have their place. And Axios is different again because Axios Local is doing sort of hard news, but at a local level, at a city level. So I think all of these things are in the mix now in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been 5 years ago, exactly because of the tech that Chris has talked about. I don't think it's all about, I say this all the time, I don't think it's all about money. I think what Chris said about the passion is at the root of so much of what people are doing. But long term, it's the sustainability that comes. And sustainability is a two-way street, right? If you've got loads of money, if money is no object, then everything's sustainable. But if money is tight, then you cut your cloth to fit. So you do end up with a publishing organization that only has 2 or 3 people on the ground, but maybe that's enough because your scale is determined by how much money you can make.
But I suppose that is the key point, isn't it? Is actually having enough people on the ground to serve the local community. Yeah. Because part of the problem with the UK in terms of its local news provision is that a lot of the cases we don't have journalists, with boots on the ground, and that's why some of those local startups are really, really interesting. When I was doing some research for this, I thought it was really interesting to find out that there's been some developments like that across Europe, particularly where local news intersects with state support, which obviously was one of the potential recommendations of the Cairncross report. So Digital News Report 22 notes that in Denmark, 3 news organizations launched new local news services in 2021, with a total of 75 journalists being hired across 3 titles to fill those gaps. And what I thought was really, really interesting is Finland. Obviously, kind of we know that they're a bit of an outlier in terms of who pays for news. But 39% of those who pay for news say they're paying for regional or local news online, which, as far as I know, completely dwarfs the proportion of people who are paying for digital local news, either in the US or the UK.
Chris, from your point of view, working with the Digital News Initiative internationally, that must get really complicated. How do you sort of identify projects that are relevant locally but also relevant internationally?
Yeah, it's such a interesting and fun part of my career to become involved with what is truly a global effort. Not something that is focused solely on the country in which I reside, the U.S. And what we've observed is there are certainly common themes across the globe as it relates to journalism, but then there's a great deal of differentiation and localization country by country. So our approach is to try to deeply understand. Right. We if we take it from like an engineering standpoint, I always tell my team, default to requirements gathering, ask questions, like understand what's needed, what are the challenges. And so that's our general approach with the Google News Initiative as well. We know a lot, but we don't assume that we know everything. So we're always asking what's needed. And when we try to do that at scale, it's difficult to connect with everybody, right? We find that there are some organizations who may not be aware of the resources that are available to them through our work and through the work of many other organizations. But we'll do things like you'll see us do what we call innovation challenges, where we will put out kind of a presenting problem and say, here's a challenge. Who has some ideas and plans for how to address this? And it's an open application process, and then we will provide funding for those projects. And we're always asking for outputs from that. So those projects may directly benefit that one organization primarily, but we expect a playbook out of that, so that learnings can be shared as widely as possible. So it's not an easy thing to solve, but I think it's important to simply recognize the challenge as you've stated it, Chris. Like to not assume that the challenges are identical country by country.
I think that playbook approach is really interesting. That you can actually, there's a process that you can start here and end up here, and solve some of these problems.
And I think there is. My hope, or our hope, is that there is a lot of stuff that is common. So if we take subscriptions, for example, the principle of presenting a user with subscription options and moving them through a workflow that to hopefully, they convert and they become a subscriber, that probably doesn't look too different depending on where you are in the world. The digital advertising model is relatively similar across the world. I mean, certainly subject to local laws and some variation there, but at the end of the day, it's a website with some ads on it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there are a lot of learnings that can be shared broadly in that regard. And our approach has been, we like to do cohort-based learning. So we'll do subscription labs and ad transformation labs where we have a group of publishers who go through the experience. So they're being lifted by the content, but then they're lifting one another along the way by constantly sharing learnings.
So going on then to our key media moments from 2022, which we always like to do to sort of like spark or rather highlight a couple of moments that we feel have been pivotal in the year. Mine is that the Digital News Report had a great data point this year about the disparity between younger and older people when it comes to local news. So it found that there's a 19 percentage point difference between under and over 35s when it actually comes to being interested in local news, i.e. news about my region, city or town. That's how they defined it. And that's the largest disparity of any topic mentioned, so it dwarfed interest difference in sport, in, charity endeavors. And so it seems to me that there is a big challenge to be addressed here in actually appealing to younger audiences, particularly when it comes to local hard news. Peter, do you think that's been borne out with what we've seen in the UK?
I haven't seen anything specific on the local end of things, so I don't know that if I was going to say kids, no, it gets me slapped.
I'm technically still in that under 35. Yeah. I'm not a kid by any means.
You and Esther. But I think younger people, I think they get their local news in different places. I think they do turn the social media into Facebook, probably not Facebook, actually, probably TikTok. But I think it becomes about their cohort rather than going to, my mom still buys her local evening paper. It's a town of about 150,000 people, probably less now. She still buys it. And they, her generation bought that because they looked at births, deaths, and marriages as much as anything else. They knew people round about, and they still buy it. I'm not sure that kind of tie to your local area is the same as it used to be because probably of social media.
Yeah, your cohort is now no longer tied to geography. Yeah, it's like online.
Exactly. And if you're looking for somewhere to eat or somewhere to go at night or something to do or a sports club or whatever, you'll find it online. You won't find it in a local paper.
So my question for the two of you then is this a genuine generational difference that has been, put into effect by the rise of social media? Or is local hard news something that you grow into as you buy you buy property, as you sort of become more dependent on local services? What do you think? And I suppose it is different in the US, but to what extent do we think that is something that is also almost an artificial generational difference?
My take on that is it's almost an anthropological question, not a news question, right? It's just about human behavior. And Peter, as you were speaking, what I was thinking about is, I think you're so right. It's I don't know that we win as a news ecosystem if we focus on how we think people should consume content. I think we win if we focus on doing deep research and understanding how people want to consume content, and there are going to be differences by by all different types of groups. And so I think there's a lot of value in having kind of like a profound relationship with reality, right? in terms
There's
of
a quote, right?
in terms of where people are going, what their expectations are. It's not. I don't know that it's about a disinterest in knowing deeply what's going on in one community. It's just that we as human beings, we have varying identities, and we develop our identity through a bunch of different sources, and I don't think it means that local is less relevant. I think it's just different.
Chris, I think you've got to the heart of every single issue with the modern media landscape there with that one phrase. That's not just local news.
Put that on a webpage and stop. One of the things I would say is that there's two things going on here that I think is, one is good, one is bad. I think that actionable, almost service journalism, I think people will step into that gap quite easily. That's what 6am City is doing, and I think local groups on Facebook and whatever will do that. So here's my local football team, or here's my local I don't know, Scouts, Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or whatever it is. That stuff will get done because people care passionately about the things that they're involved in. What won't get done, and this is the bad part, is the kind of hard reporting on what, on your asshole local councillors, and actually picking them up on the bad things they do, that investigative reporting, or actually it's not necessarily investigative reporting, it's just showing up to council meetings and listening to people talking utter nonsense.
Making sure that they know that we know that they're talking crap. And
I know, so the guys at Social Spies at the Walthamstow Echo or Dispatch, I think it's called, they do that stuff. They actually go to council meetings and report on that stuff, and that's really, really important, and that's not going to get picked up the same way, I don't think. No. So there is, if younger people are not involved in that sense, then that could become a problem from that democratic deficit point of view.
Just going to end my little section on a note of optimism, though. There's a really good Press Gazette article about why Bristol has become a
remember that,
local news oasis almost, and as part and parcel of that, they are talking about how younger people in Bristol, because they comprise a huge section of the population, from students to, it's quite a cosmopolitan area, so a lot of young people like to move there, are genuinely supporting some of that hard news. So there is hope here. It's just about finding a way to, as Chris mentioned, find that roadmap and make it sort of more widely applicable. But Chris, I am fascinated to hear about what you've chosen as your key moment from the past year, because it just seems to cut to the heart of so much of what we're talking about when we talk about local news and how it funds itself.
Yeah, I liked reading a report that came out of Lion, which is a U.S.-based organization for smaller news publications, and their research showed that the income of, the revenue of these small organizations increased from 2020 to 2021. And the data showed that some of that increase was driven by contributions directly from the community. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, it goes back to what we were starting to talk about at the beginning, which is, is this evidence that there is an increased understanding of, we as consumers of news, that news is hard to produce, and news requires support and supporting the business model in a variety of ways. So I thought that was cool. We heard similar sentiments from one of our moments as well that we enjoyed. We did a community news summit in the U.S. Just a couple of months ago, and lots of great learnings came out of that. I was what I liked hearing. What I thought was interesting is my career at Google actually started more in the ad side for publishers, and so I have a bit of a soft spot for ads. And the digital advertising session at that community summit had some of the, if not the highest ratings of any of the sessions. So all around the table, all have the potential to thrive.
Nice. I wondered, not to throw cold water on that, but obviously we've heard that there is potentially a global slowdown in ad spend coming over the next couple of years. We've had everyone from Martin Sorrell say it. Zuckerberg's been saying it. Is local news poised to take advantage of that slowdown in sort of the smaller entrance into that space, or are we just as exposed to that as anybody?
My observation, and from talking with publishers and on a local level, local marketers are still going to need to try to achieve their business goals, and local marketers are very interested in local publishers as marketing partners. And I think that is a bit shielded from some of the massive shifts that we see in programmatic advertising from major national and global advertisers. So I think it's a bit different. In some ways, I think smaller local publishers have an advantage there because they can provide connection to communities that some larger publishers cannot. So I have some optimism in that regard.
And Peter, based on the fact that you were nodding quite vigorously towards the end of that, that's something you share?
I'd agree with that. Yeah, because I think that kind of, we saw it during COVID, the growth in that kind of local advertising. And I think a lot of that is, it's almost a direct response advertising thing. It's like I see a restaurant, I book a table. Or I need, some kind of DIY supplies or whatever, and so I go to my local shop. And I think that is a different thing than whether some big brand wants to take a Super Bowl ad or whatever. I think that's a very different kind of advertising.
So, my media moment. There were loads to pick from. I actually found this really hard to choose. There was a really interesting report from the Charitable Journalism Project about how local Facebook groups are supplanting local newspapers as the default source of information in many British towns. And I kind of thought, well, this must be happening in other countries as well, given the prevalence of Facebook. I know we discussed it a bit when it came out. The report came out at the time on the podcast. The report basically found that although consumers were sometimes describing these Facebook groups as toxic and racist, a lot of them said that they actually provided more up-to-the-minute information than their local newspaper. And it's things about, traffic, building works, local events. People end up going to their Facebook groups for that. I actually identify quite a lot with that because I definitely get all of our local news from two groups. There's like a Evesham local and then one for our like tiny little village. And yeah, I find them really, really useful, and I find myself using them for exactly the same reasons that I would probably normally go to a local newspaper. But our local newspaper is terrible. But there's one example. The town of Trowbridge in Wiltshire has 44,000 residents, and more than 30,000 of them are in a single Facebook group. And a lot of people in these Facebook groups, when they were asked, had commented that the new style of local journalism, which these Facebook groups had replaced, was felt to be commercialised and, on occasion, damaging and divisive, which does feed into, I suppose, a lot of the stuff we've seen with the Reuters news report, things like that, where people are increasingly just feeling very, very mistrustful of this very sort of clickbaity, commercially driven content. In terms of what it means for publishers, I suppose, the people interviewed, they did really want a trusted source of local news. The demand is very much there, and I think that's why we see so many of the people we talked about, here in the UK, we've got the Manchester Mill. I know we've mentioned quite a few of the US ones. People want the trusted source, but they either couldn't find it or have found current provision inadequate. So they're turning to these Facebook groups to sort of supply that, I suppose. Don't necessarily know if that's a good thing or not.
Peter, yours, you actually have more of a question, I suppose, than a media moment from the past year, don't you?
Always. That's always a question.
Won't put the work in to come up with a moment, but we'll ask a question.
We'll never suggest a solution, just ask a question. Well, my thing is, we know that news avoidance is growing everywhere, in the States and in the UK, and probably more than anywhere else in the world, for some would say obvious reasons, if you look at our politics.
I laugh, but it's a nightmare.
That kind of news avoidance thing, I don't think will be fixed by publishers, or certainly at a national level, that are looking to sweat out as much profit as they can without putting any journalism effort in. Here's an example of why people are avoiding news.
Right.
If you go on any local live website at the moment, almost, you will see how that area will be affected by a nuclear strike from Russia. That's the laziest bullshit journalism in the world. And I can understand people avoiding that kind of news.
People don't seek out like
Sussex going to be affected by a nuclear strike on London. So I wonder if local news can actually fill that void, because it's about if you're just fed up listening to stories about COVID or vaccines or whatever, or you're fed up listening to the politicians slag each other off and the war in Ukraine, it's hard to listen to a lot of that stuff. But if you're looking at more positive local news, the idea is that, well, some good stuff's going on in this area, and 6am City is a great example of that. Where he's talking about, Ryan Heafy was talking about that, avoiding the partisanship, but talking about how you can get involved in a park cleanup, how you can get involved in supporting your local Rotary, whatever it is. Then that's much more positive. It is still that democratic deficit, I think. But there's loads of examples. I was at that conference I was at in Edinburgh. There was a magazine called Govan Hill, which is amazing. They publish that community has something like 28 languages in it, and it's not a massive area. And they get involved with all these different groups, ethnic groups and whatever. And there's this real community spirit around that publication. And the one I was trying to remember the name, Waltham Forest Echo, they're actually getting involved properly in council meetings and stuff. So there's all this stuff going on. Chicago Sun-Times, I said, has just dropped its paywall, is now a non-profit. And weird stories like there's a retirement area in Florida called The Villages, who prints more copies of their paper than the local paper in the Atlanta metro area. They've got a population of 130,000, and the Atlanta metro area is 6 million, and these guys in Florida print more copies of their paper. So there's all these stories that are like, it gets back to what Chris says, I guess, about the passion for the community. It goes right back to that. So can that get people engaged in news again? Hopefully. But I think for publishers, it means that you've got to kind of put scale to one side. We've been banging on about that forever.
Well, we've been banging on about that for, Media Moments 2029.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I have some optimism there that I think local news providers are in a prime position to rebuild some trust that has been lost. And it really is about that, and providing authoritative quality content and journalism, because let's face it, there have been many studies that show that there's been a decrease of in trust in news. I was speaking with a professor at a U.S. university a few weeks ago, and they said that there's a big problem here. Like, where's the next generation of journalists going to come from? They said that they had an advanced journalism class that had 3 people in it.
Oh, Christ!
Right? I mean, think about that. Like, that is, and that's not just because people aren't aware of news as a viable career. It's there's something else under there, probably a lot of things. And so I think local news providers, like I said, just that have probably a greater opportunity and ability than most to truly build trust among their users.
And we will definitely talk about that when we do our session on trust, because that's one of the things we always talk about in our Media Moments 2022 report, or rather Media Moments Every Year report. But for now, Chris, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to have that conversation. It was a whistle-stop tour through everything to do with local news, and we could have spoken about every single one of those issues in depth for the entire hour. So thank you so much for coming on. If anybody wants to connect with you, where's the best place for them to do so?
LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. There's another Chris Jansen out there who is the CEO of Kantar Research. So make sure you find the right one, because it's been confusing because I used to work at Kantar. So it's been quite confusing for a number of people. But if I could just leave your listeners with one thing, if you're a journalist, if you're a news organization, or planning to become one of those two things, and you're wondering, here's a challenge I have, is there any way that Google can be helpful? Please assume the answer is yes, through a variety, programs, products, and partnerships. We're in it for the long haul. We want to be helpful.
Thanks to Membership and Subscription Suite Pool for sponsoring this season of the Media Voices podcast and our upcoming Media Moments 2022 report. Their all-in-one platform helps publishers convert, manage and retain their members and subscribers. You can find out more about them at pool.tech, that's POOL.tech, and we'll link to them from our show notes at voices.media. And don't forget, you can pre-register to download the Media Moments 2022 report by going to voices.media/mm22.
But for now, thank you so much. Next week, we're going to be looking at how the subscriptions market has changed in 2022. Chris, we could just as well have got you in to talk about that and what publishers have done to adapt to challenging conditions. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.